a matter of fact that because you had these big C Conservatives coming out welcoming it, I think some people jumped to the conclusion there's some sort of ideological exercise going on here. But from my point of view, there really wasn't. I don't want the BBC leaning this way or that way. I just want it straight and impartial and fair.
In her resignation statement, Deborah Turner said that the recent allegations that the BBC News is institutionally biased are wrong. Do you think the BBC is institutionally biased?
No, I don't, and I'm sure someone's going to correct me pretty quickly if I'm wrong, but I just reread the memo yet again outside the door here. I don't think I used that phrase anywhere in the memo, and I do not think it's institutionally biased. Let's be very clear. Tons of stuff the BBC does is world-class, both factual programming and non-factual programming. I was a political correspondent at the Daily Mirror, Sunday Times, other places for 14 years. I think the standard of BBC Westminster is exemplary. And that's why I keep saying these were incipient problems. We were finding the odd problem here, the odd problem there. And the crucial thing was, when I say odd problem here and there, every single thing we spotted, as per my memo, seemed to me to have systemic causes. And the root of my disagreement and slight concern even today is that the BBC was not, and I hope they will change, but will they, treating these as having systemic causes. There's real work that needs to be done at the BBC.
Do you think that the failings that you highlighted were serious enough to require the resignation of the DG and the head of news?
Not if they had a plan to get on top of things and treat these things as systemic problems. I mean, look, I'm keenly aware. I don't want to come before you sounding like I'm some sort of pompous figure, right? It's not necessarily for me, humble old me, to tell the Director General of the BBC exactly how to do his job. But you've asked me a straight question. I would have hoped they'd get on top of these problems, start sorting them out in a systemic and more methodical way, and everything would have been fine.
What do you think, Carolyn?
Well, my experience was that the BBC took issues of impartiality extremely seriously. We've all heard Tim Davie put impartiality at the centre of his time as Director General. In the 3 years I was involved with the BBC, and prior to that with the Sirota Review, I felt it was a continuous process, an active debate. These are dynamic issues. They're very complicated issues often of impartiality. They're decided in the context of individual programmes on a daily basis across thousands of hours of coverage. So there was a healthy debate. I mean, you've heard from Michael, in the EGSC, it was a healthy debate and often a very robust debate about some of these issues. But in my view, was the BBC willing to have a proper conversation, debate, and actually take action? In my view, yes, they were.
Thank you.
Thanks. Before we get into the a little more about the issues arising in the memo, can we talk a little bit about the role of the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee? You're here obviously as external advisors to it. Can you just talk about the purpose of it, how each of you were recruited and appointed to it?
Yeah, do you want to go first, Caroline?
I can go first if you like, Jeff. So I got involved with the BBC first of all via the Nick Sirota Review. I'd spent 20 years in journalism, most of it at the Financial Times, but also at the New Statesman and the Economist magazine. The BBC really matters to me. As an institution, I think it's extremely important, and as Michael said, particularly in the era of AI, when I spent a lot of time on AI, when 52% of the internet is supposed to be generative AI generated, I think it's an extraordinarily important institution to get this right. I worked on the Nick Sirota Review for about 6 months. It was a significant review. And then when the opportunity came up to become an editorial advisor to the committee, I was very keen to help enforce what we'd found in the Sirota Review. There are multiple recommendations in the Sirota Review, which I can walk through, but at a high level, one did include having broader editorial advisors on the committee. And that's what led to us being appointed. Part of that was led by Ofcom, who wanted to expand the range of editorial opinion available to the BBC. The second thing which came out of the Sirota Review, which was a key part of our implementation and actually the day-to-day work in the committee, was the introduction of new thematic reviews. These are really significant pieces of work. They took many months of work. They were usually hundreds of interviews behind them, and they were very comprehensive reviews of impartiality and BBC coverage. So we looked at immigration, for example, on the committee. They looked at the role of coverage of the economy. These were very important pieces of work, and I think they are comprehensive and extremely detailed. and they were ongoing. Alongside that, there were independent reviews of programs, there was monitoring of impartiality, there were new guidelines initiated in terms of training. So if I sort of give that's a quick sketch. There are many other, I think we had 39 recommendations from this rota review in the end that we were involved in implementing on behalf of the committee. So a lot of the work in the first 2 years was very much implementing the rota review and the outcomes.
It's a fantastic run-through by Caroline. I'm not sure, is there any bit of your question you think is unaddressed that I can actually add value with?
Well, I suppose, am I right to read into what Caroline said then, that you're looking, in terms of these thematic reviews, you're not just looking at things that have gone wrong, the committee, you're looking at future challenges, proactive kind of looking ahead?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that first. So one of the key tasks of the committee is future editorial risks. So, I mean, Michael's account gives a personal view of what was of issues on the committee for him. One of the issues I was particularly interested in, and really important obviously, is the role of AI. And is the BBC embracing AI, thinking about it appropriately? And in an era of fake news, it's even more important. So we did have reviews of looking at the role of AI at the BBC. When I left the BBC in the role, one of the issues I spoke to Chris Saul about was how far are we making sure the committee continues to have enough time for really deep dives into future editorial risks. Much longer sessions on some of those issues I think would be really welcome.
So, again, Caroline summarised it fantastically. These thematic reviews, to your point, so they are proactive. They're not waiting for an obvious thing to go wrong, or was that quite right? Which was the case with a lot of things in my memo. But even on the thematic reviews, you see, my disagreement with the BBC is about the thoroughness with which it takes action and follows things through in this area of editorial standards. So if you take one of the thematic reviews, I think it may have been the first one, which was on tax and spend. How does the BBC cover issues to do with the economy, government tax spending, and so on? And there were a number of recommendations from that. One of them being, for example, that it should become routine that if someone is on a News Current Affairs show and says we need more money spent on X, then they should be challenged, well, that's fine, what's the trade-off? Do you want tax to go up, whatever? That was one of many, but a very simple to understand recommendation from that review. And I remember when the conclusions came before the committee, I think it was my first or second meeting, I asked what the follow-up was going to be. For example, because at that stage I didn't know the ins and outs of how every bit of the BBC worked. So I said, after each news show or current affairs show, will there be a tick list? Were people challenged in accordance with these new recommendations? And I was pretty much told, look, don't worry about it. Everyone knows this report. Everyone in the BBC's read it. Everyone takes it very seriously. Now, one way and another, partly because of my long, years ago as a journalist for 20 years, I know all sorts of people in the BBC, from a junior sub-editor I worked with in the 1980s to very senior people. Not one person I spoke to had read the report. Very few were aware of it. And later on, when we got follow-up reports, they did not give a gold star 10 out of 10 for implementation. So every step of the way, I'm afraid, I feel the BBC fell short on thoroughness when it came through to implementation.
And to what extent is that the fault of the committee? You talked about there are systemic causes and systemic problems. Is that where do they lie?
I think, I'm afraid to say this, ultimately with management, the Standards Committee has got independent advisors, Caroline, myself, it's got non-executive members. I do give credit to the management, by the way, and this may sound a trivial point, I was always impressed with it. These would be meetings that would go on 2-3 hours. The Director General, Head of News, Deputy Director of News always made time, fully attended, paid full attention. But to your question, I don't think it was the committee that was at fault. I think there's simply something, the BBC, I just think, had a bit of a blind spot when it came to following through as methodically as I appreciate I'm only one individual, but as I thought they should.
Is that the fault of individuals, though? You talked about systemic, but it sounds like you're putting the blame on individuals for not following through.
Well, I don't know whether it's a management culture thing or an excess of faith in how things will be implemented down at programme editor level. But to get to the answer to that, that's exactly the kind of thing I'd like them to look into, by the way. I mean, you're almost borderline now talking about these systemic faults that I'm so obsessed about. I think they needed to look at why the implementation was not better.
Thanks, Jeff. Can I just Caroline, Michael writes in his memo that he found Jonathan Munro and Deborah Turnus quite defensive when issues were raised. Did you?
I think the BBC is the most scrutinised media organisation in the country. From my experience at the Financial Times, it was a very different level of public scrutiny. It's scrutinised obviously by this committee, by members of the public, by editorial complaints, by its audience. And obviously there are many ways to make a complaint to the BBC. But in my experience, are there times when they're necessarily defensive on some issues in that context? Yes. But as a broad sort of characterisation, I would say I did not find the BBC to be defensive. I found the BBC to be actively engaged in discussions about how to improve issues of partiality on very complicated subjects. And this is a live, dynamic debate when the context changes all the time. It's very hard. It's not one and done. This is obviously a live debate. I think there can be differences of opinion about whether the BBC went far enough on some of the issues that were raised in the committee. And some of the issues that were raised were significant issues. But actually what's important is that the BBC were raising them themselves. They were coming up via the EGSC commissioning research from David Grossman to help facilitate that robust debate and that review of impartiality.
And in terms of the EGSC, I'm keen to sort of get a little bit of a flick. I mean, in effect, you guys had this unique opportunity to be almost a fly on the wall of how this committee is working as independent advisors to it. So you could just give us a flavour, you know, how were decisions reached? Would you say that there was a degree of camaraderie and common purpose when it came to the pursuit of impartiality and journalistic integrity on the EGSC?
I'm happy to answer that first.
Yeah.
I found it to be an active debate in the committee. I mean, you'll hear from Robbie and your next panel. He's robust in how he expresses his opinion and wants the BBC to do well. So I found there were a lot of issues that we covered in the committee. I mean, Michael's given an account of some of the issues, but actually most of the committee was involved in looking at things like editorial complaints, monitoring impartiality across the BBC, looking at reviews of the BBC, thinking ahead about issues that were coming up. There was a broad range of issues that we debated on the committee, so it wasn't always a contested space, but there were areas of the committee when there were significant issues to be discussed. And obviously you've seen some of the research from David Grossman, which is in Michael's report, and of course that led to an important discussion. But I would say each time the executive team would come back and then debate those issues with us. And ultimately, we were both advisors to the committee, and it was obviously for the committee itself, which were the 4 board members, to sort of work out what significant action should be taken next.
What you've just said, it sounds like some of the committee members were more vocal than others, or more dominant in the conversation.
I wouldn't agree. I think it was a very open committee. People could say what they thought. And
the EGSC has been politicised in the way that it came to some of these decisions. In this morning's Guardian, it suggests that all members came from a certain political viewpoint. Is that your experience?
I wouldn't be my characterisation of how the committee worked now.
And I endorse everything Caroline says. You know, most of it was great. They were very respectful, open discussions. I think I'd have to check this. You know, most of the decisions that were taken were unanimous. So, I mean, I know there's some people saying this is a weird tick list that Prescott's come up with in his memo, but my memo simply quotes extensively internal BBC reports. I think maybe with 1 or 1.5 exceptions. They were all commissioned by the full committee. There was an awful lot of consensus. The one area, I hope I don't end up being a broken record, but the one area where there was not consensus was particularly those reports by David Grossman, fabulous, very professional ex-Newsnight reporter. The reports he was coming through with, so many of them quoted in my memo, there was not unanimity in how to respond to those. Clearly, you can see it in the memo. But other than that, I would totally endorse what Caroline says.
And there was no one member of that committee that was more dominant than the other?
No. I don't think so. Anyway, that's never my impression.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Prescott, you've just said that the BBC is not institutionally biased. What is your bias, if you have one?
Well, it's always a tough job, isn't it, spotting your own biases. I mean, you know, when you read about these centrist dads, I think I'm a centrist dad. That would probably cover it. I mean, actually, you know what? To that question, there are a lot of people. I know you folks haven't gone here so far, but there's been a lot of stuff in some of the papers about Robbie Gibb, and the chair was asking, was one personality more dominant than another? You're asking about my preferences. I am no ideological soulmate of Robbie Gibb, for example. I'm a centrist dad.
I'm a centrist dad too, but a company that you work for received over £100,000 from Larry Ellison, a Republican mega donor. You'll be aware that Donald Trump has removed funding from a lot of public service broadcasters. Is it true that you actually want the BBC to be impartial,
Yes.
based on those affiliations?
It's totally true. Yes, of course it is.
You said there's some real work to be done at the BBC. Along what lines? Do you think any of that work should be done at the boardroom level?
I think it's a job for the executive, overseen by bodies like the board and the Standards Committee. And if I give you an example, it might help explain what I mean. One of my sadnesses was that when this thing did leak into the public domain, that so much focus, I do understand why, but so much of the focus went on to Trump panorama, okay? But for me, the most heartfelt, the thing I felt most passionately about was the BBC put out one day, over 12 hours on all its bulletins, a story saying that ethnic minority people in this country were being charged more for their insurance purely because of their ethnicity. And when David Grossman looked into this, he found the story to be utterly untrue. I mean, so it was a dreadful thing to have put out, particularly given, it's wrong. It must have been deeply upsetting for many people out there, particularly ethnic minority people who heard that story all day long. Anyway, it was untrue. So you just have to ask yourself, okay, how could the BBC get this so wrong? Who had the idea of doing this story? Who conceived of it? Who did the initial research? Who did the initial reporting? Who wrote the script? Which editors cleared it across the whole of the